Hello again, students. I thought that as a follow-up to my last recording lecture, if you will, on my interpretation of Calvino's 14 criteria of classic literature, that since I also asked you to think about and connect Calvino's criteria to the texts that we're interrogating for today, that I would maybe, after you've done so, do the same thing. So what I wanted to do was in this little snippet is to talk specifically about Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour, and some of the ways in which I think it applies to or that Calvino's criteria for classic literature applies. So first of all, the story itself, and you'll see this at the bottom, gives a little biography of the story, was written and published in 1894. And so obviously that speaks to its lastingness. That is, there's some universal qualities that asks us to consider this story, even though it was written in 1894, as connecting to something enduring and universal. And I'll talk about the themes a little bit, the important questions that are relevant and universal here in a second. But it's interesting to note that this particular story, and many of the works that Kate Chopin wrote actually, were classified as scandalous at the time because of some of the themes that they dealt with. Obviously, The Story of an Hour deals with the death of a husband and the epiphany that the wife has, Mrs. Mallard, of maybe living her real true life after the death of her husband. That would be scandalous in 1894, and because of that, really her work wasn't again considered seriously until the 1950s, and you can probably guess as to why. The 1950s and 60s maybe saw a resurgence and rebirth of literature specifically dealing with gender and women's issues, which a lot of her stuff does, including her often cited novel, The Awakening. So there's something enduring and lasting, and what's interesting about this story too is that even though it was challenged and even though it was oppressed, if you will, because of its scandalous nature, really in the 1890s through the first part of the 20th century, it resists that critique and exists. This, Desiree's Baby, a few other stories, and The Awakening itself are read as canonical classic literature, especially as it's dealing with some of the issues it deals with today. So there's a way in which it resists that criticism and still sort of exists there. Some of the important questions that it asks are relevant and universal. I mean, obviously, this story is about relationships, specifically marriage. Some have offered that it's a critique of marriage. And in 1894, that would have been a very scandalous thing, but we can still think about that today. Obviously, it deals with women's rights, but it also deals with identity. You know, the idea of who are we? Who are we, and how do we define ourselves? How do we define ourselves in relationship to other people, whether it's parents or, in this case, a husband? And what happens when we have to think about who we are without them? So some of those things, obviously, those are important questions that this text asks. And it doesn't let us get away from those things. It asks every single one of us to think about them. But we don't have to have been in a marriage, for instance, for us to have for this text to be relevant to that. We can apply it, and I think this story asks us to think about those things larger than just the marriage between Mr. and Mrs. Mallard, but rather identity as it's largely writ. You know, obviously death and death and life. Those are universal themes as well. Some of the ways in which this story is a story that asks us to reread it, I think, is also one of the criteria that applies from Calvino's 14 criteria of classic literature. And when we come back to it, and I was noticing in some of your discussion posts that you even indicated this, that the first time you read it, It seemed pretty simple, but there were some things that you didn't quite get. You read it again, and every time you went back to the text, you realized that maybe there was a little bit more there. I call that the heart of a story. Every story, every poem, every piece of literature has a heart. That heart may be different for each one of us, but it's the thing that calls us back to it. When we're called back to it to read and reread, we realize that it is layered, that there are things there that we missed before. There's something different about each reading. And I want to point to three specific things in this text, I think, that create that sense of deeper meaning. The first one, I think, is irony. This is a text in which dramatic irony and irony in general is talked about quite a bit. And some of that has to do, it's recognized right away, but I'm going to look at the first and the last lines. Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. The reason that's irony is if we go all the way to the bottom, we don't necessarily think anything about that the first time that we read it. As a matter of fact, we think, oh my gosh, she has a bad heart. But notice a heart trouble, right? So it sets up the plot, but it also sets up this theme of heart. Okay, go all the way to the bottom. Right? And when her husband walks through the door and she thinks he's dead, this last line, when the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, a joy that kills. So that notion of heart, which is in the first sentence, is also sort of reiterated here in the second sentence. And the story asks us to think about the ways in which heart can be defined. Obviously, we can think about a heart as the organ that pumps blood through our bodies, and certainly that the story asks us on the superficial level to see it as that. That is, she had a heart attack when she saw that her husband was there, right? But this story asks us to define, that is, to think about heart also in that other way that culturally we think about heart. We know that this story, one of the themes of the story is marriage, relationships, love, and death. How else do we define heart? Well, I heart you, that is, I love you. So it asks us in some ways to think about that other definition of heart as it's placed together. And that's how irony works. Irony places two interpretations of something together, fuses them together, and asks you to think about them both at the same time. Because if you read it one way, it seems to be something. If you read it another way, it seems that it's possibly something else. But when you actually have them both existing at the same time, there's something happening in the text that asks us, right, at the same time to sort of deal with that double meaning. So obviously this text is asking us to think about what actually killed her. That's what the irony is doing there. Why did she die? Right, and I don't think it's as simple as we think it is. That's that deeper layered meaning, right? Think about that, of a joy that kills. Was she happy that her husband was back and she was overjoyed so she died? Or was she happy in the middle of the story when she realizes that she gets to live her life for herself now? And when he comes back, that joy has been ripped from her, and because of that, she dies. Right? The story can be read both ways, and that's irony. It actually is both ways to some extent, if you think about it. It's not just one or the other, but it's both. So irony is very important. Number two, there is a narrative or point of view here, and we'll do a lot with point of view, that asks us to think, right? Who's telling us the story? And this is an omniscient third-person narrator. And what that means is that and you see that here, that this omniscient narrator knows things that the characters themselves don't know. Mrs. Mallard is the protagonist of the story, but this narrator is telling us things as if this narrator knows things that Mrs. Mallard doesn't as well. And that's important for us because Mrs. Mallard can't understand what she's going through, this epiphany, right? She doesn't understand. This narrator seems to suggest to us that she knows, and that Mrs. Mallard is learning, and that's really important for the story. It adds layer and depth. So I'll show you an example here. There stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank. So that what we get here is that it's just describing what she's doing. But look at this. Pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach to her soul. She could see the open square before her, all these sorts of things, right? So what we get is this blend of describing what Mallard's going through, but then also suggesting something deeper. That is, Mrs. Mallard doesn't know it's reaching into her soul, but the narrator does, and because the narrator does, so do we. But it's just mentioned in that way, right? She sat there with her head thrown back, right? She was sobbing. But here, again, there was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name. But she felt it creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her, though, through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. Now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. So what we have with this third-person omniscient narrator is a chance to see an interpretation of things that are happening that Mrs. Mallard doesn't know. So because of that, we see an epiphany before she knows it's coming, but we're also allowed to sort of see it with her, to feel it with her. So that narrative point of view, that third-person omniscient narrator, adds a layer or creates a sense of deeper meaning here. And then finally, I would say that the notion of epiphany itself. The theme of epiphany suggests something is coming, and we realize something only after it happens. And in some ways, the theme itself of epiphany asks us to think about whether or not our own reading or experience of this text is itself an epiphany. And that is, going back to irony, that there's something going on here that we can't quite figure out, and then it hits us. And that epiphany asks us to confront this idea of, is it possible that a woman becomes so overjoyed, and why? That she can live her life for herself, and once that's ripped from her, that she dies. That is, that her death is not the joy of getting her husband back, but the joy of losing herself. Once we hit that epiphany, it forces us to think about whether or not that's a good thing. All right, which then comes up to that notion of identity, what defines us. When we are in a relationship, are we different than we're not in a relationship? When we're in a relationship and married, what does that mean in terms of the obligations we have to that person, to other people, versus living a life of our own? So in those ways, all of these things are wrapped up. So I'd like you to think about some of those things again. I'd like you to go back into the story and read it. I'd like you maybe to go back into your own discussion questions, the posts that you did about this, and maybe think about how you might answer those a little bit differently. If you have any questions, reach out. Thanks a lot for listening. I'll see you soon. Bye.